Imagine discovering that everything you believed about Jesus Christ's diet was completely wrong. That historical evidence, lost for centuries, reveals shocking secrets about what was really on the Messiah's table. Prepare for a journey that will shake your deepest convictions about early Christianity. If you're ready to unravel mysteries the church has hidden for 2,000 years, subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell, because what you're about to discover about the Ebionites will completely change your understanding of Jesus. This isn't just another conspiracy theory. These are documented facts that have been deliberately suppressed. The Ebionites were first-century Jewish Christians who claimed to have direct knowledge of Jesus' original teachings. They preserved traditions dating back to the apostles themselves, traditions that drastically contradict the Christianity we know today. Their dietary practices were radically different from what we imagine about Christ's life. Ancient documents reveal that these early followers of Jesus followed extremely specific dietary rules. They completely rejected the consumption of animal meat, considering it an abomination before God. For them, compassion for animals was a fundamental principle of true Christianity, taught by Jesus himself. But why was this information hidden? Why did the early church fight so fiercely to suppress Ebionite teachings? The answer is buried in theological conflicts that determined the course of all Christendom. And at the center of this battle was a seemingly simple question: what did Jesus really eat? The Ebionites possessed their own gospel, known as the Gospel of the Ebionites, which contained completely different accounts of Jesus' life. In this lost text, Jesus is portrayed as a passionate defender of animals, someone who saw animal sacrifice as a corruption of true worship to God. Fragments preserved by early church writers show Jesus categorically rejecting the traditional Passover. According to the Ebionites, when the disciples asked where to prepare the Passover meal, Jesus replied, "Do I desire to eat flesh this Passover with you?" This rhetorical question revealed his clear stance against consuming animals. Ebionite manuscripts describe Jesus purifying the temple not just because of the commerce, but specifically for the cruelty to animals. They reported that Jesus freed doves and other animals destined for sacrifice, declaring that God did not desire bloodshed, but mercy and compassion for all creatures. These ancient texts presented a Jesus who taught that the kingdom of heaven was open to all sentient beings. Salvation was not exclusively human, but extended to all of creation. This revolutionary cosmological vision put the Ebionites in direct conflict with other emerging Christian currents. Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, mentioned traditions that confirmed these teachings. He cited sources that described Jesus consuming only bread, olive oil, fruits, and vegetables. But why were these traditions gradually abandoned and forgotten by the official history of Christianity? Modern archaeology has uncovered fascinating evidence about the dietary practices of early Christian communities. Excavations at Ebionite sites reveal a complete absence of animal bone fragments in contexts of communal meals. This physical evidence corroborates textual accounts of their vegetarian practices. Papyri discovered in the 20th century contain fragments of Ebionite letters discussing food preparation for religious celebrations. These recipes include only grains, legumes, fruits, nuts, and honey. There is not a single reference to the preparation of meat or fish for sacred occasions, drastically contrasting with other communities of the era. The Ebionites developed a sophisticated theology to justify their dietary practices. They argued that Eden represented humanity's ideal state, where humans and animals lived in perfect harmony. Meat consumption was seen as a divine concession after the fall, not God's original plan. This theological interpretation had profound implications for the understanding of Jesus' mission. The Ebionites believed that Christ came to restore humanity to the original Edenic state, including the paradisiacal diet based exclusively on plants. His death and resurrection symbolized the end of the bloodshed era. Patristic documents reveal intense debates between Ebionite leaders and other Christian groups on these issues. Epiphanius of Salamis recorded theological discussions where the Ebionites cited Old Testament prophecies about a future where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, as evidence that God always intended a creation without violence. Ebionite traditions preserved in Syriac and Arabic sources contain extraordinary accounts of the dietary habits of the apostles themselves. According to these documents, Peter, James, and John continued to follow the dietary practices that Jesus had established, abstaining completely from animal meat throughout their ministerial lives. Most striking is the testimony about James, the brother of Jesus. Hegesippus, a 2nd century Christian historian, confirmed that James never consumed meat or wine, and that he was known in Jerusalem as the Just, partly due to his extreme compassion for all living creatures. Clement of Alexandria preserved a tradition stating that Matthew, the evangelist, survived only on seeds, nuts, and vegetables without meat. This information is particularly significant because Matthew was a former tax collector, someone who certainly had the resources for a varied diet, but deliberately chose a plant-based one. The Acts of Peter, an apocryphal text, contains passages where the apostle refuses offers of meat during his missionary travels. He explains to the Gentiles that following Christ means abandoning practices that cause unnecessary suffering to God's creatures. This message was central to Ebionite evangelization, but perhaps most intriguing is the account of John, the beloved disciple. Traditions preserved by the Ebionites suggest that John's exceptional longevity was directly related to his pure diet. They believed that compassionate eating was one of the secrets to the deep spiritual life John demonstrated in his writings. The discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls have brought to light surprising connections between the Essenes and the Ebionites. Both groups shared restrictive dietary practices and a theology that emphasized ritual purity through compassion for animals. These parallels suggest a doctrinal continuity from sectarian Judaism to early Christianity Qumran. Fragments describe Essene communal meals composed exclusively of bread, fruits, vegetables, and pure water. The Damascus document mentions specific prohibitions against the shedding of animal blood, except in cases of absolute survival necessity. This ethic was considered preparation for the coming Messianic age. Subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss a single detail of this revolutionary historical investigation. We are unearthing evidence that has completely changed our understanding of Christianity's origins. What you'll discover in the following parts will shock even the most experienced scholars of church history. The Qumran Manual of Discipline contains passages that perfectly echo Ebionite teachings on diet. The Essenes believed that spiritual purification required not only immersion rituals, but also a diet that did not cause suffering to other creatures. This connection suggests that Jesus may have been influenced by these traditions during his formative years. Recent analyses of jars and utensils found at Qumran reveal exclusively plant-based residues. No traces of animal fat or blood were found in any of the vessels used for ceremonial meals. This archaeological evidence confirms that the dietary practices described in the texts were rigorously followed by the community. The systematic suppression of Ebionite teachings began in the 2nd century, as the Church of Rome consolidated its authority over other Christian currents. Leaders like Irenaeus of Lyons and Tertullian launched deliberate campaigns to discredit the Ebionites, labeling them as dangerous heretics who threatened Christian unity. Patristic documents reveal a coordinated strategy to destroy Ebionite texts. Epiphanius of Salamis openly admits that many Ebionite writings were burned by episcopal order. This systematic destruction explains why we only have fragments of a tradition that once flourished throughout the Middle East. The motivation behind this persecution was not only theological, but also political and economic. The Ebionites rejected emerging episcopal authority and maintained egalitarian community structures. Their restrictive dietary practices also threatened established industries linked to animal sacrifice in the meat trade. Jerome, in his letters, mentions deliberate efforts to correct manuscripts containing Ebionite teachings on diet. Scribes were instructed to alter passages that could be interpreted as support for Christian vegetarianism. This textual manipulation explains many of the inconsistencies in the canonical Gospels regarding Jesus' dietary practices. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD represented the final blow against the Ebionites. Their doctrines were formally condemned, and their followers were forbidden from participating in mainstream Christian communion. Those who insisted on maintaining their traditional dietary practices faced excommunication and, in some cases, physical persecution. Recent excavations at first-century archaeological sites in Palestine have revealed dietary patterns that challenge traditional narratives about early Christianity. In Pella, where the Ebionites took refuge after the destruction of Jerusalem, archaeologists discovered communal kitchens without any evidence of animal meat preparation. Analysis of coprolites, fossilized feces, found in latrines of early Christian communities shows predominantly plant-based diets. These scientific findings corroborate textual accounts of the dietary practices of Jesus' early followers. Biological evidence does not lie. It reveals exactly what these people consumed daily. Mosaics discovered in 4th century Ebionite churches depict scenes from Eden with an abundance of fruits and vegetables, but no representations of animals being consumed as food. These artistic images reflect a theology that viewed plant-based eating as a return to the original paradisiacal state. Inscriptions on Ebionite tombs contain unique symbols related to agriculture and plant cultivation. Grapes, wheat, olive trees, and fig trees consistently appear as decorative motifs, suggesting that these foods held deep spiritual significance for the community. Notably absent are symbols related to fishing or animal husbandry. Fragments of pottery with Aramaic inscriptions found at Ebionite sites include recipes for special breads used in religious celebrations. These recipes mention only plant-based ingredients: flour, olive oil, honey, dried fruits, and spices. The absence of any animal products in these sacred preparations is historically significant. The Gospel of the Ebionites, known only through citations from patristic writers, contained revolutionary passages about Jesus' attitude toward animals. Epiphanius preserved a fragment where Jesus declares, "I have come to abolish sacrifices, and if you do not cease sacrificing, the wrath of God will not cease to pursue you." This lost gospel described Jesus healing not only humans, but also injured animals. A passage cited by Jerome recounted Jesus restoring a bird's broken wing and reprimanding his disciples for not showing compassion to all of God's creatures. These stories painted a portrait of Christ as a universal protector of life. Fragments preserved in Syriac sources include unique parables about the kingdom of heaven, using exclusively agricultural metaphors. Jesus spoke of abundant gardens, bountiful harvests, and fruit-bearing trees as symbols of eternal life. Notably absent were parables about fishing, shepherding, or any activity involving the use of animals. The Ebionite gospel contained an alternative version of the feeding of the multitudes, where Jesus fed the crowds with only bread and fruits. There was no mention of fish in this version. The Ebionites argued that this was the original tradition, and that references to fish were added later to justify meat consumption. Clement of Alexandria cited a particularly powerful passage where Jesus explained that true love extended to all sentient creatures. He who truly loves cannot cause unnecessary suffering to any living being, the text stated. This compassionate ethic was fundamental to the Ebionite understanding of the gospel. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential theologians of early Christianity, made intriguing references to Jesus' dietary practices in his biblical commentaries. Though cautious due to ecclesiastical pressures, he suggested that Christ's diet was purer than that of ordinary Jews of his time. John Chrysostom, known as Golden Mouth for his eloquence, preserved traditions describing Jesus consuming only fruits of the earth during his desert fasts. These references, though brief, suggest that even mainstream church fathers had knowledge of traditions regarding Jesus' plant-based diet. Basil of Caesarea wrote extensively on Christian compassion for animals, citing teachings he attributed directly to Jesus. While not explicitly stating Christ was vegetarian, his homilies contained ethical principles that logically led to that conclusion. He spoke of unnecessary violence against God's creatures. Augustine of Hippo, in his Confessions, mentioned debates he witnessed between different Christian groups regarding diet. He referred to certain sects who claimed to follow Jesus' original dietary teachings. While not specifically naming the Ebionites, the description perfectly matches their practices. Most revealing is found in the writings of Jerome, who had direct access to Ebionite manuscripts before their destruction. In a letter to Augustine, he admitted that certain ancient traditions suggested that Jesus and his closest disciples followed a diet that did not shed blood. This confession is extraordinarily significant coming from such a respected source? Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312 AD marked a radical transformation in the nature of the Christian faith. Christianity ceased to be a religion of the marginalized and persecuted and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. This shift had devastating consequences for groups like the Ebionites, who maintained practices considered extreme by the new imperial orthodoxy. The Edict of Milan not only legalized Christianity, but also established specific criteria for which Christian groups would be officially recognized. The Ebionites, with their distinctive dietary practices and their rejection of episcopal hierarchy, were deliberately excluded from this legitimization. Their marginalization became systematic and relentless. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea not only to resolve Trinitarian issues, but also to standardize Christian practices throughout the empire. Ebionite traditions regarding diet were deemed Judaizing and therefore incompatible with the Gentile Christianity that Rome favored. This political decision had lasting theological ramifications. The new alliance between church and state created economic incentives to suppress Ebionite teachings. The animal trade, the leather industry, and other economic activities based on animal products were important to the imperial economy. A Christianity that questioned these practices represented a threat to established interests. Imperial documents from the 4th century show specific orders to confiscate and destroy Ebionite texts. Libraries were systematically searched, and scribes were instructed to correct manuscripts containing teachings deemed heretical. This campaign of cultural destruction was so effective that it almost completely erased the Ebionites from history. Modern linguistic analyses of the canonical Gospels reveal layers of editing that suggest deliberate alterations to passages related to diet. Aramaic words preserved in some ancient versions indicate that Jesus used specific terms for pure food that did not include animal meat. These linguistic nuances were lost in later translations. The Greek term broma, food, appears in the Gospels with inconsistent meanings, suggesting that later editors expanded its definition to include meat. Syriac manuscripts preserve versions where Jesus uses words referring specifically to fruits of the earth when speaking about proper food for his followers. 3rd century papyri contain fragments of early Christian prayers where the faithful thank God for the gifts of the garden and the bounty of the earth. These liturgical formulas make no reference to animal products, suggesting that early Christian communities had a different understanding of sacred eating. Inscriptions in early Christian catacombs include symbols representing exclusively plant-based foods, breads, grapes, stylized fish that may represent Christian symbols rather than actual food, and various fruits. The funerary iconography reflects the dietary practices and eschatological hopes of these communities. Ancient Christian glossaries preserved in Eastern monasteries define Christian food in ways that exclude animal meat. These theological dictionaries suggest that, at least in some traditions, there was a clear understanding that authentic Christian eating should be plant-based. This definition was gradually altered as orthodoxy solidified. Although the Ebionites officially disappeared from history by the 5th century, evidence suggests their traditions survived in marginal Christian groups throughout the centuries. The Bogomils of the Balkans, the Cathars of medieval France, and other heretical movements maintained dietary practices that distinctly echoed original Ebionite teachings. Cathar manuscripts discovered in the 20th century contain explicit references to the pure teachings of the first followers of Christ regarding diet. These documents cite traditions dating directly back to the Ebionites, suggesting a secret line of transmission that survived the persecutions of the early centuries. If you are fascinated by these hidden historical connections, subscribe to the channel now. We are revealing links between Christian movements separated by centuries but united by secret traditions about Jesus' true teachings. What you discover will revolutionize your understanding of Christianity's history. The Waldensians, persecuted by the medieval Catholic Church, preserved texts containing teachings on the diet of the apostles. Inquisitors reported that these heretics refused to consume meat, claiming to follow the original examples of Jesus and his disciples. These inquisitorial reports, ironically, preserved evidence of surviving Ebionite traditions, Eastern monastic communities, particularly in Syria and Egypt. maintained restrictive dietary practices that may have Ebionite origins. Although officially justified as ascetic disciplines, these traditions preserved elements of Ebionite theology on universal compassion and dietary purity. Some monasteries never served meat at their communal meals. Recent advances in molecular archaeology are revolutionizing our understanding of early Christian dietary practices. DNA analysis of food residues found at first-century Christian sites reveals dietary patterns that precisely match Ebionite descriptions of plant-based eating. Mass spectrometry applied to kitchen utensils discovered in early Christian communities detects only organic compounds of plant origin. This irrefutable scientific evidence confirms that at least some early Christian communities followed exclusively vegetarian diets, exactly as Ebionite texts described. Isotopic studies of skeletons found in early Christian cemeteries show chemical signatures consistent with plant-based diets. The bones reveal carbon and nitrogen ratios indicating minimal to no consumption of animal protein. This biochemical evidence perfectly corroborates historical accounts of Ebionite practices. Paleobotanical analyses of early Christian archaeological sites identify an impressive diversity of cultivated and consumed plants. Preserved seeds, pollens, and plant fragments show sophisticated agriculture focused on grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. The absence of evidence of intensive animal husbandry for food is notable. Radiocarbon dating of food remains found in the refectories of early Christian communities, confirms that these dietary practices were contemporary with the first centuries of Christianity. These are not later developments but traditions dating back to apostolic times, precisely as the Ebionites claimed. Monastic libraries in Syria and Iraq have preserved early Christian manuscripts that escaped the systematic purges of the early centuries. These texts, written in ancient Syriac, contain traditions about Jesus that differ significantly from the canonical Gospels, especially on issues related to diet and the treatment of animals. The Syriac Gospel of the 12, discovered only in the 19th century, contains passages where Jesus explicitly teaches about compassion for animals. A particularly revealing section describes Jesus reprimanding fishermen for causing unnecessary suffering to fish. He teaches them methods of subsistence that do not involve violence against sentient creatures. Apocryphal acts preserved in Syriac describe early Christian communities that followed the master's diet based exclusively on plants. These documents report that the apostles established communities where meat consumption was considered incompatible with Jesus' teachings on universal love and compassion. 3rd century Syriac homilies cite traditions dating directly back to the Ebionites regarding Jesus' dietary practices. A text attributed to Ephraim the Syrian mentions that the Lord fed himself only on the fruits that the earth offered willingly, a clear reference to agriculture without animal exploitation. Ancient Syriac liturgies contain prayers of thanksgiving that mention only plant-based foods. These liturgical formulas preserve a sacramental theology where bread, wine from grapes, fruits, and vegetables are the only elements considered appropriate for the Christian table. The absence of references to animal products in these prayers is theologically significant. The Ebionites developed a sophisticated theology that connected plant-based eating with Christian soteriology. They argued that the salvation offered by Jesus included the redemption of all creation, not just humanity. This revolutionary cosmological vision placed compassion for animals at the center of authentic Christian experience. Ebionite texts preserved in patristic citations describe Jesus' teaching that the kingdom of heaven was a state of perfect harmony among all living creatures. Violence against animals was seen as a spiritual impediment that distanced humans from this divine reality. Compassionate eating was therefore a fundamental spiritual practice. This Ebionite theology interpreted Jesus' crucifixion as the final sacrifice necessary, forever abolishing the need for bloodshed. They viewed Christ's death as the end of the sacrificial era, ushering in a new dispensation where compassion replaced violence as the organizing principle of spiritual life. The Ebionites connected their dietary practices with Old Testament messianic prophecies about a future where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb. They believed that Jesus had inaugurated this prophetic era and that his followers should live in accordance with this new reality, anticipating the coming kingdom through their dietary choices? Fragments of Ebionite sermons describe Jesus' resurrection as a demonstration of divine power to renew and restore life without destroying other lives. This unique theological interpretation connected Christ's victory over death with an ethic of life that refused to cause unnecessary death to any creature. The discoveries about Ebionite dietary practices and their possible connection to Jesus' original teachings have profound implications for contemporary Christianity. Millions of Christians worldwide are rediscovering these lost traditions and questioning how they can inform modern Christian faith and practice contemporary Christian movements, such as creation, theology, and green Christianity find in Ebionite traditions a solid historical basis for their environmental and ethical concerns. These groups argue that compassion for animals and sustainable eating are authentic aspects of Christian discipleship, not just personal preferences or contemporary fads. Theological seminaries in various Christian denominations have begun to include courses on Christian ethics and animal rights that critically examine Ebionite traditions. Theology students are discovering that the history of Christianity is far more complex and diverse than traditional curricula suggested. Christian archaeologists are re-examining first-century sites with new questions about dietary practices. Research projects funded by Christian universities are applying modern technologies to investigate Ebionite claims about the dietary practices of early Christian communities. Christian publishers are releasing translations of newly discovered or re-examined Ebionite texts. These books are finding receptive audiences among Christians seeking a deeper and more historically informed understanding of their faith. Public interest in these issues is growing exponentially. The Ebionites guarded more than just different dietary practices. They preserved a complete vision of how Jesus' first followers lived, worshipped, and understood his message. Their traditions included specific fasts, prayers at set times, and a deep relationship with nature that reflected divine care for creation. These practices formed an integrated system of faith that connected body, mind, and spirit in ways that many modern Christians have completely lost. Archaeology has revealed fascinating evidence about early Christian communities that supports many Ebionite claims. Excavations at sites like Qumran and other areas of ancient Palestine show dietary patterns, kitchen utensils, and meal remnants suggesting predominantly vegetarian diets among Jewish religious groups of the time. These findings are not coincidences, but pieces of a larger puzzle about how early Christians truly lived their daily convictions. What most intrigues scholars is how these practices were so quickly lost in official Christian history. Documents discovered in the last century show that entire communities maintained Ebionite traditions for centuries after being declared heretical. They continued to practice their beliefs in secret, preserving texts and teachings that directly contradicted the narratives accepted by the dominant church. This silent resistance suggests they believed they possessed something genuinely valuable and authentic. The implications of these discoveries go far beyond dietary issues. If the Ebionites were correct about fundamental aspects of Jesus' life, it raises profound questions about other Christian doctrines that developed later. Their beliefs about Jesus' human nature, the continuity of Jewish law, and the importance of social justice may represent older and more authentic layers of early Christianity that were deliberately suppressed or forgotten. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the Ebionite legacy is their integrated view of spirituality. For them, there was no separation between caring for the body through conscious eating and nourishing the soul through prayer and meditation. This holistic approach to faith offers valuable insights for contemporary Christians seeking more authentic and complete ways to live their spirituality. The question remains, are we willing to reconsider traditions that may connect us more deeply with the origins of our faith? The rediscovery of Ebionite teachings is causing significant waves in Christian communities worldwide. Pastors, theologians, and lay people are re-examining their understandings of diet, spirituality, and biblical authenticity in light of these ancient revelations. Theological seminaries have begun to include studies on Ebionite Christianity in their curricula, recognizing that ignoring these perspectives leaves important gaps in understanding early Christian history. This academic shift is gradually influencing sermons, Bible studies, and theological discussions in contemporary churches. Contemporary Christian vegetarian and vegan movements have found powerful historical validation for their convictions in the Ebionite discoveries. Organizations like the Christian Vegetarian Association report significant increases in membership and interest following the dissemination of research on the dietary practices of Jesus and his early followers. These groups are not just promoting dietary changes, but arguing for a broader transformation in how Christians relate to creation, animals, and environmental sustainability based on authentic biblical principles. Resistance to these ideas has also been substantial and revealing. Traditional denominations have expressed concerns about how these discoveries might destabilize established doctrines and practices accepted for centuries. Some religious leaders argue that focusing on aspects like diet distracts from more central issues of Christian faith. However, this resistance raises important questions about why certain historical information is considered threatening and what that reveals about the flexibility or rigidity of different Christian traditions. The impact extends beyond religious borders, influencing discussions on food ethics, animal rights, and environmental sustainability in society at large. Secular philosophers, activists, and academics are examining how Ebionite practices can inform contemporary debates on conscious consumption and moral responsibility. This intersection of ancient faith and modern concerns is creating unique dialogues between religious and secular communities that rarely find common ground for discussion. Perhaps the most profound impact is on the individual lives of Christians who discover this information. Many report a sense of liberation in finding historical precedents for practices they always felt were more aligned with their Christian values, but seemed outside the mainstream. Others describe a journey of questioning that leads them to re-examine not only their diets, but their entire approach to faith, tradition, and spiritual authenticity. These personal transformations may have lasting consequences for the future of Christianity. We have reached the end of an extraordinary journey through centuries of hidden history, surprising archaeological findings, and revelations that challenge much of what we thought we knew about Jesus and the early Christians. The evidence we have examined, from apocryphal gospels to archaeological finds, from the writings of church fathers to the practices preserved by the Ebionites, paints a fascinating and complex picture of Jesus' possible dietary practices and their importance to early Christian faith. If you've made it this far, you're likely processing information that could transform your understanding of Christianity, tradition, and spiritual authenticity. Don't subscribe to the channel just yet. First, let these revelations truly sink into your consciousness. Consider how these discoveries might influence not only your perspective on Christian history, but also your own spiritual choices and practices. Truth has the power to transform, but only when we allow it to work deeply in our hearts and minds. The question of whether Jesus was vegan may never be answered with absolute certainty based solely on historical evidence. However, the weight of the evidence we have explored, the practices of the Ebionites, archaeological discoveries, ancient texts, and preserved traditions, strongly suggests that at least some of Jesus' early followers believed his diet was plant-based and that this was an integral part of his spiritual teachings. This possibility should give us pause and make us reconsider our own practices and assumptions. More important than definitively resolving the dietary question is recognizing how these discoveries invite us to a deeper, more questioning, and authentic faith. The Ebionites remind us that early Christianity was diverse, dynamic, and deeply connected with practical issues of how to live according to Jesus' teachings. They challenge us to examine whether our modern traditions truly reflect the values and practices of Christ's first followers, or if we have lost essential elements along the way. The truth about Jesus and the Ebionites is not just a historical curiosity, it is an invitation to transformation. Whether you are a Christian seeking a more authentic faith, a scholar interested in religious history, or simply someone curious about the origins of one of the world's most influential religions, these revelations offer opportunities for growth, questioning, and discovery. Now, if these ideas have resonated with you and you want to continue exploring the hidden mysteries of Christian history, subscribe to the channel and join a community of people brave enough to question, discover, and grow together in the pursuit of truth.